The United States Senate just rewrote the treaty provision of the Constitution. It just rewrote the treaty provision of the Constitution, which is what I talk about all the time, how these people in Washington, D.C. usurp the Constitution all the time. And yet when I talk about an Article 5 Convention of the States, oh, we're going to have a runaway convention, oh, this, that, and the other, oh, don't you support the Constitution? This may be over the heads of most commentators and people on TV and radio, but it's not over my head and it won't be over yours. The treaty provision of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 2, could not be clearer. The President shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. Provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. That is, they either voted up or voted down. It's a supermajority of senators present. Now, why did they do that? Well, Alexander Hamilton tells us why they did it in Federalist 75, as I've talked about since last summer. The history of human conduct does not warrant that exalted opinion of human virtue which would make it wise in a nation to commit interests of so delicate and momentous a kind as those which concern its intercourse with the rest of the world to the sole disposal of a magistrate, created and circumstanced as would be a president of the United States. This crucial power must not belong to one man, to a president. It must be shared. And Hamilton went on to point out, though it would be imprudent to confide in him solely so important a trust, talking of the president, yet it cannot be doubted that his participation would materially add to the safety of the society. It must indeed be clear to a demonstration that the joint possession of the power in question by the President and Senate would afford a greater prospect of security than the separate possession of it by either of them. So it's a dual obligation by the men who created these bodies and this federal government in the first instance. And yet Bob Corker, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is walking around today like a rooster. Great accomplishment. Even got Barbara Boxer to vote for it. To vote for what? To vote for what? You see, ladies and gentlemen, the way it's supposed to work, something this momentous, something this crucial in changing the relationship, quote unquote, between the United States and Iran requires more than an executive action. It requires more than a statute. It certainly requires more than the UN. It requires a treaty. A treaty that the Senate can vote up or down, approve or disapprove. That's the way the process is supposed to work. But it won't work in this instance for several reasons. Number one, you see in the last weeks this phony framework where Obama, our supreme leader, and Iran's supreme leader are saying two different things about the same framework. Our imperial, lawless president and their Islamo-Nazi leader can't even agree on what they supposedly agreed on. That's number one. Number two, your United States Senate, with a majority of Republicans, 54 Republicans, vote us in, we'll repeal Obamacare, they didn't. We'll cut spending, they didn't. We'll secure the border, they won't. Oh, now what we need is a president. What? Jeb Bush. Your Republican Senate has utterly and completely capitulated. I don't care if it's unanimous or not. Now, as best as we can tell right now, this deal with this Corker and Lindsey Graham, I might add, Congress gets to review the deal for 30 days after June 30. And unless Congress rejects it, requiring 60 votes up front and 67 to override a presidential veto. 60 votes up front to overcome a filibuster. Obama can lift sanctions any time after that 30-day period. So, we've turned the treaty provision on its head. Instead of requiring 2/3 of the senators present to approve the treaty, this bill explicitly, with Obama's blessing, he's pretending that, oh, I'm not that comfortable, but I'll take it, that you need 67 votes to override a presidential veto, to undo what Obama's done. Am I making sense, Mr. Producer? Are you able to follow this? All right, so it's been turned around. It's been turned on its head. Now we need a supermajority to override the president, rather than a supermajority where the president needs approval for a treaty. The Republican Senate has no more respect and faith for our Constitution than the Democrat president. They're in it together. They also stripped the provisions, had been discussed earlier, requiring Obama to certify every 90 days after sanctions are lifted that Iran is not engaging in terrorist activities. The White House said that provision would have been impossible to uphold. So why are we in this at all? Think just for a moment. Step back from all the static, all the yik-yak. Let me ask you a question. We are entering into an arrangement, ultimately on June 30th, with a terrorist regime. The word terrorism or terrorist under international law has meaning. It has meaning. The Geneva Convention that relates to terrorism is explicit that terrorists and terrorist states are so thoroughly lawless, they're not to be treated, even in a state of war, as you do an enemy. Terrorists are not to be treated as prisoners of war. They're so loathsome to humanity and society. So here we are, soon to enter into some kind of deal with the Islamo-Nazi terrorist regime in Tehran. Terrorists because they won't follow the rules of war laid out in the Geneva Conventions. And yet somehow they're going to follow the rules of this deal, which is nebulous and ambiguous, where our imperial lawless president and their Islamo-Nazi leader cannot even agree on what they supposedly agreed on in this framework. And now the Republicans have participated. The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, this Bob Corker, who's way over his head, with the assistance of Lindsey Graham, have come up with language that's so outrageous, so weaselly, that even Barbara Boxer has thrown in. Because they got the go-ahead from Obama, who the New York Times has reported is prepared to sign this bill. Of course he is. All this bill does is give cover to the Congress, where they can pretend that they're doing something substantive. They can pretend that they're doing something serious. They can pretend they actually have a role in overseeing sanctions, when in fact, your Republican Senate will never be able to cobble together 60 votes to override to override a filibuster, or certainly 67 votes to override a presidential veto, should the Congress decide that enough is enough and there needs to be sanctions. The whole process has been turned around. It's been turned on its head. Bob Corker and the Republican Senate has just dragged the Republican Congress into a disaster. And your Republican Congress is happy to support it because it's a fig leaf. One more time. Rather than the president needing 67 votes, or that I should say more accurately, 2/3 of senators present to vote for his treaty. Now it's going to take 60 votes to stop him. And if they get that 60 votes and overcome a filibuster, it's going to take 67 votes to override his veto. The entire treaty clause has been turned over on its head, and the United States Senate has not only, in this instance at least, whitewashed the treaty power out of the Constitution, it has made it impossible for the Republican Senate to stop Obama. 3 cheers for Bob Corker. 3 cheers for Lindsey Graham. 2 morons. And now you watch as pseudo-conservatives and Republicans all over the place praise this. You watch as the Republican leadership praises this, as they surrender the Constitution to an imperial president who's about to arm up the Islamo-Nazi regime with nukes, with intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Russians see it. Now Putin is going to sell them S-300 missile batteries, the most cutting-edge defensive missile weaponry they have, that will make it incredibly difficult for not only the Israelis to hit targets within Iran, but should we decide to do so one day, it will tie our hands immeasurably as well. What a complete and utter disaster.
Mark Levin.